All right, so this is part two of the Adorno and Horkheimer lecture for media theory class. So when we left off, we'd established a background and the backstory of Adorno and Horkheimer, the context in which they wrote the story. Or, I'm sorry, wrote the article. We talked about the Frankfurt School, and we talked about the Enlightenment and their theories concerning the Enlightenment, and how reason, in some sense, the sort of the ne plus ultra of the Enlightenment led eventually to what they considered to be a kind of unenlightenment. And we got into the culture industry and the way that these industries market similar products again and again, but to different demographics that they've classified in a kind of scientific way. And we looked at briefly, or at least I discussed Batman and the idea of this capitalist myth of the billionaire savior saving the world from a communist villain and so on. And so this brings us to a discussion of style and culture. And Adorno and Horkheimer say, listen, the culture industry is aware of style, right? It monitors various formal possibilities. In other words, it looks at all the different ways that art is produced and is manifest in the world. And when we see new effects, right, these effects, these new ways of, let's say, making films or making TV shows have to conform to old patterns in ways that affirm and increase the power of the conventions of storytelling that already exist. Right? So even the styles that we think are new or exciting really are not. They traffic in old hat, as they say. So the exciting new stories are really the old stories, but just told in new ways. And indeed, the power of mass culture is so powerful that it can assimilate seemingly unconventional styles. And here they talk about Orson Welles, and they use Citizen Kane as an example. So Citizen Kane, when it came out, was regarded, and still is regarded in many ways, as the greatest movie that's ever been made. And it earned that designation because of narrative inventiveness, the way the story is told. The beginning is the end is the beginning, much like Pulp Fiction, if you've ever seen that. There was all kinds of revolutionary cinematography, the use of deep focus, for example. The sound recording in the film was quite novel and interesting. So it broke with a lot of conventions, but at the same time, the story was easily understandable and was quickly assimilated. And all these new techniques that emerged in Citizen Kane were then became part of the larger system. So what Adorno and Horkheimer is saying here, remember, their argument is that the culture industries produce this kind of sameness, right? Like everything's the same. And so even when something new pops up, what they do is they grab onto it and they co-opt it, they assimilate it into the big machine and just make it part of it. So there's no real risk of a kind of revolutionary form of art that's going to come along and disrupt the status quo, because when something new or revolutionary happens, they glom onto it and they make it part of the system, right? And so as a result, the products of the culture industry are a function of a uniform and ideologically determined style, right? So again, these passages are complicated, but they're, in many cases, when you read them and you unpack them, it's kind of easy to see their point. So here, for example, they say, by subordinating in the same way and to the same end all areas of intellectual creation, by occupying men's senses from the time they leave the factory in the evening to the time they clock in again the next morning with matter that bears the impress of the labor process they themselves have to sustain through the day, this subsumption mockingly satisfies the concept of a unified culture. So what they're saying here is that, and again, this is during the period where manufacturing is huge in the United States. So they see people going to work in these factories, but then when they leave the factory, what they do is they consume factory-created art, right? Films, radio programs, magazines, right? These things, art that's made on an assembly line. And it's made using the same process that they employ all day. I mean, in a sense, you can't get away from this model, is what they're saying. And these things reinforce the lifestyle that these folks are living, right? That it's all part of one big capitalistic totality. Okay? So they go on and they say if there is really a nonconformist within the context of the culture industry, they don't ban them, they just ignore them. So they conclude the only way to resist is to fit in or make one's peculiar brand of deviation part of the system. Realistic dissidence is the trademark of anyone who has a new idea in business. No one can be really outspoken. Seeming critique finds a quick reconciliation. So again, if someone is in or trying to get into the Hollywood system or into the music industry, um, if they're really different, if they're so different that they can't be co-opted and pulled into the machine, they're just ignored. Right? You don't see these people's movies in the theaters. You don't see their shows on television. You don't see their books in the bookstore. Right? You don't hear their songs on the radio. So originality and spontaneity, these things, even a little critique, they said, they play a role in the culture industry's operation. And this is a form of liberalism. But it's a liberalism that's attuned to the laws of capitalism, right? One is free not to conform, but if you don't conform, then you're powerless, right? Both economically and intellectually. So you're free to make movies that are critiques, right? That are social critiques that don't conform to the American system, to the capitalist system. But if you're going to do that, you're going to end up powerless, right? You're not going to have money. Nobody's going to really listen to you. You're going to be a crank, right? And so they say in today's society, the myth of success exercises a particularly powerful influence, especially on the masses. So what's going on here, right, is that there is this myth of success, that this success that we all want to get to. But the reality is that you can't get to that success if you're an artist or a businessman without conforming to this system, this factory-like capitalist system in which everything is the same. Right? Where style is all the same. It's important to recognize here, for example, when we're talking about film, American films are made according to the continuity style of editing. And it's a cinematic grammar that all filmmakers have to follow. Right? I mean, if you want your film to be seen, if you want it to be purchased at Sundance, you have to follow this pattern. And if you don't, then you won't have power and influence, right? It's a system that perpetuates itself, rather, I should say. So again, they're all about sameness, and they say a persistent sameness governs mass culture. It is not new. It constantly recycles the past, providing variation on well-known themes. And of course, this is obvious if we look at things like sequels, right? There's kind of a permanent sameness to sequels. James Bond has been around in one form or another since 1962. So that makes him, 60 years old as a cinematic character, 70 some years old as a literary character. But, they've been making James Bond movies since 1962. And every James Bond movie, to some extent, although the editing changes and the actors and actresses change and so on, it's the same story. And we see it with Hollywood's, more direct kind of sequels, where there's, Jaws 1, Jaws 2, Jaws 3, Saw 1, Saw 2, Saw 3, right? There's sequels where we're just rehashing these same ideas. As I sit here and I give this lecture, right, we're 3-4 episodes deep into the Game of Thrones sequel on HBO. Now, there are thousands of other fantasy kinds of stories that are equally compelling that they could go out and pick up, but they don't, right? There's this persistent sameness. And part of the reason for the sameness is dictated by financial concerns, right? People watch the original Game of Thrones series, so they'll probably watch the second one. And they invest a lot of money in it, and there's a lot of risk in that, right? But nevertheless, whatever the reason that they keep going back to the same stories, recycling the past, it is a retelling of the same story, right? The wheels must be kept turning, they say, even if they only go around in circles. And here you see another example of that with The Great Gatsby, right? So this is The Great Gatsby, the Baz Luhrmann, Baz Luhrmann, yes, version from 2013 with Leonardo DiCaprio. But before that, there was The Great Gatsby in 1974, The Great Gatsby that they made in 2000, The Great Gatsby that they made in 1926, The Great Gatsby that Hollywood made in 1949, right? There's nothing original here. We literally recycle the same story again and again. These aren't even sequels. It's the same story. So you see, there is something to their claim of Hollywood sameness, of culture industry sameness, again and again and again. So this sameness doesn't just extend to things like making the same movie again and again. It's about the film's formal or literature's formal and stylistic spheres. So in other words, the way that the story is told the same all the time. So if you've taken screenwriting, if you know anything about screenwriting, you know that every movie has a 3-act structure with a setup, a confrontation, and a resolution. Acts 1, 2, and 3. So even if I'm telling a love story as opposed to an action story, they both have the same 3-act structure. This is that sameness they're talking about, right? That we get the same thing again and again and again. And by the way, this 3-act structure goes all the way back to Plato. So, I mean, it goes back thousands of years. There's a sameness in terms of editing and cinematography. Anything that you watch has an establishing shot in it that shows you where the action is going to take place. Dialogue is shown in all American movies in the shot, reverse shot format. They're all edited the same. They all use the same kinds of camera angles and same kinds of ideas and present the same 3-act structures, right? So here again, we see there's this sameness that Adorno and Horkheimer are talking about. So in making and circulating this fantasyware, right, that's what they call it, the culture industries embrace everyone. They're trying to bring in the moneyed few as well as the working masses. And in this sense, it's even more powerful, they say, than serious art is or was. Right? Serious art, they say, excluded the working class, who had it so hard that who had time for serious art? So, it offers both. It brings together serious art and light art. It brings together art and distraction, spectacle. And it collapses all this together into one false formula, which is the totality of the culture industry, right? And of course, film does this. We see serious artists, people like Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino, some names you might know from filmmakers, who work inside of genre films, right? They're not making, they're serious artists making light art, the genre film, right? It collapses these things together. There's when you watch one of their films, if you go and you watch The Wolf of Wall Street, or you watch Goodfellas, might be a better example. When you watch Goodfellas, what you're seeing is a combination of high art in his filmmaking and distraction, right? There's the spectacle of the gangster and the killings and so on, right? It collapses all of this together in ways that art never has before, right? Art used to be a a serious thing for the upper classes. But now it's for everyone, and even your studies. Even your studies, we've collapsed high art into low art. Right? There are people that are studying. The French New Wave, which arguably is high art, and people studying, slapstick comedy, which is low art, right? I mean, we've collapsed all these things together. And then they suggest, of course, that this is part of the imperative of capitalism, right? That it does this, and it needs to do this in a way in order to be effective. At the same time, we've generated this notion of amusement in modernity, which is serious business in and of itself. And amusement, they argue, has become another form of work, right? So amusement is sought after as an escape from the mechanized work process, from the factory, from the assembly line, and to recruit strength in order to be able to cope with it again. So what they're saying is that your leisure, in a sense, even back then, during the 1940s, before we did things like, work from bed, check our email from bed, right, and all this stuff, that work is, or rather that amusement is a form of work. You have to, you get out of your factory job and you go to the movies and you consume the factory-created media for an escape so you could go back and function effectively at the factory again next day, right? It's a really bleak kind of view of existence. And of course, today, this has been taken even further. As I noted before, I mean, amusement is work. Work and leisure have combined in this weird way. So you have things like Facebook, right? You have Mark Zuckerberg here thanking you. Facebook, who creates the content for Facebook? Well, you do. During your leisure time, when you sit around and create posts. Without the users, there is no content on Facebook. You're creating the product that Facebook is selling to you. It's the same with Instagram or TikTok. You create the videos, you create the photos, you post them. I mean, your leisure time is working for Mark Zuckerberg. You see? I mean, it's sick in a way when you think about it. That you're the one who's generating the products that have turned these people into billionaires. The new robber barons of the new millennium. So even when you think you're relaxing, you're working. You don't see how the culture industry has manipulated you, right? And so they go on, and of course they're the angry Muppets, right? If radio stations and movie houses were to disappear overnight, few people would really miss them. This bloated pleasure apparatus adds no dignity to men's lives. The culture industry amounts to one gigantic fraud. Its promises of a fuller, better, and happier life are never kept. The promissory note which, with its plots and staging, I'm sorry, I lost my place. The promissory note, which with its plots and staging, it draws on one pleasure, is endlessly prolonged. The promise, which is actually all the spectacle consists of. So, the promise, which is actually all the spectacle consists of, is illusory. God, so I told you, I mean, these guys are hard to read, right? Like I can't even read it out loud. It's so hard to read. But again, the promise, which are being promised by the culture industry, is the spectacle itself. And it's just an illusion. It actually confirms that this will never be reached. So you're like a diner who just gets the menu. You never get the meal. And I mean, when you think about it, if you think about it in modern terms, what is Instagram? Well, it's a spectacle, right? And it's aspirational. It's, I want to be like that, or I want to have that kind of attitude, or I want my house to look like that, or I want my kids to look like that, right? I mean, that's part of what it is. And it's illusory. You never get there. There's no fulfillment. It's just an endless parade of images, right? And in a way, the sex is never consummated, right? We never get there. We never get those things. We're never satisfied, right? Even if you get the BMW and the $1.5 million house, you're never satisfied. So it's like watching people, you know, coupling on screen. No seduction scene, no matter how steamy, fails to make it clear that we will never see sex being consummated, precisely because it never takes place, right? So we're always promised these things. It's always there, but we never get it. We never taste it. We never get all the way there. Like I told you, this is some bleak stuff, right? And so then they talk about laughter, and they said this is another component of amusement, and it confirms the miserable status quo. Fun is therapy, a treatment the culture industry constantly prescribes. Laughter is a crucial instrument in the fraud practiced on the human desire for happiness. So, we're laughing, but that laughing, if anything, it just disguises the fraud that's being perpetuated on you, right? And altogether, with all these things, right? The constant exposure to the media that's being generated by the culture industries, the constant pressure of having to go out and work in this capitalist system, they end up saying, above all, the system never leaves the customer alone, not for a moment, to allow him any suspicion that resistance is possible, right? So you're always exposed to this. It's everywhere, right? I mean, I wake up and I listen to the radio while I make breakfast. Then I get in my car and I listen to podcasts all the way to work, where I'm a media studies professor, and I show videos and film clips, and we watch movies in class. And then I get back in my car and listen to podcasts. And then I get home and I watch movies with the kids at night before I go to bed, and put in my earphones and listen to music while I fall asleep, right? I mean, the culture industries never leave me alone. Now, obviously, that's my choice. But at the same time, you could say, we're constantly bombarded by this. And while you're being bombarded by it, you don't even stop to think that there are other alternatives, that there are other ways to resist this kind of message. And so what happens then is that amusement works together with business and aims to affirm the status quo, keep things the way they are, to make people smile and say yes to the world. It creates a sense of pleasure devoid of thought or reflection, lacking any oppositional or resistant energy. The liberation which amusement promises is freedom from thought and from negation. So what they're telling you here, right, is that the liberation that you get from the culture industry is really just freedom from thinking, right? Of thinking and leading a considered life, right? And what you're supposed to be through all this exposure to this stuff is happy, right? Everything is awesome. And so things with movies, right? So they talk about chance. Movies emphasize destiny and chance. They impart the sense that everyone is alike and the way we are is just fine. Chance is the flip side of planning. Chance serves the real planners as an excuse, making it appear that the complex transactions and measures into which life has been transformed leave scope for spontaneous and direct relations between men. So what they're saying here is that chance is used in film and media as a kind of front, right? So movies emphasize destiny and chance. Like, what are the chances this would happen, or that this is my destiny, and so on. And this allows us to believe, right, that there's room for spontaneous and direct relations between us. But that's not really the case. And ultimately, what the culture industries do is reduce us, right? I mean, this is what capitalist industry does in some sense, is that it reduces subjects to objects. So as people, we're subjects, but we're treated as objects, right? The human being becomes mere matter. For industry is interested in people only as consumers and employees. As employees, we're made aware of the rational overall organization and asked as civilized beings to fit in. And as consumers, we see this illusion of freedom of choice, like in our beer advertisements, and the charm of novelty on the screen, and that raises our false hopes, right? So as consumers, we believe that we have these choices when we're all being fed basically the same thing, and that we can hope to be true individuals with true relationships and exist in a way where we're happy outside of the system, but we're not. And in either case, we're subjects of manipulation, right? Or objects, more properly put, of manipulation. I know this is all very grim, right? And so they address naysayers, and they say mass culture anticipates criticism, and they give naysayers the right to live in a way that where they're out of touch with the larger world, right? And so one is forced to become part of the system. The worst sin is to be an outsider. And then the culture industry works on everyone. It integrates every person into the system. And it does it with a happy face, with a cheerful countenance. But behind the happy face is a threat, which is conform or suffer, right? Become one of us, or suffer the consequences. Live in constant provincialism, right? Become a hermit, like the Unabomber, or right, like live out in the woods. But if you want to be part of this, right, you have to conform. But we're happy about it, right? We're all happy people here, so be like us. And that, of course, leads me to Everything is Awesome from the Lego movie, right? Another thing that I probably can't play without getting into trouble with YouTube, but what the hell, we'll do it anyway.
Step 13, enjoy popular music. Tap the charts again, it's Everything is Awesome. Oh my gosh, I love this song. Everything is awesome. Everything is cool with the light and the team. Everything is awesome. And we're living on a dream. Always use a turn signal. Park between the lines. Yes. Drop off dry cleaning before noon. Read the headlines. Don't forget to smile. Always root for the local sports team. Go sports team! Always return a compliment. Hey, you look nice. So do you. Drink overpriced coffee. Here you go. That's $37. Awesome! Everything is awesome. Did you see where are my pants last night? Buddy! Classic episode. Everything is awesome.
So you see, this is how then Adorno and Horkheimer see capitalism, and they see the culture industry as a method of social control that helps perpetuate this, notion that everything is awesome, right? And you got to smile and be happy and go along with the system. And if you don't go with the flow, then okay, but you're going to be ignored. You got to live on the fringes, right? You can't come to our party. And so ultimately, again, you see why I find Adorno and Horkheimer to be so depressing. I also find them to be, dangerously elitist. If you read, or if you read Adorno in particular, some of his other writings, he's horribly elitist. And it's rough reading. The ideas are quite negative. But again, you have to. This is why I give you context. And we think about them, fleeing their homes for their lives, and trying to survive in a strange new world, while their friends and relatives are being murdered in concentration camps and so on. Right? I mean, we can understand why they have this this negative impression of the world and what's going on. But my lord, it is dark, isn't it? So hopefully these two lectures have helped a little bit. It's very hard to teach theory without seeing faces and getting feedback. But hopefully I've explained a little bit of it, and this has been helpful. And thank you for checking out the video.